The soccer war that wasn't about soccer. In June 1969, two Central American countries played a soccer match, and 2 weeks later, they were at war. El Salvador beat Honduras 3-2 in Mexico City. 17 days later, troops crossed the border. The war lasted less than 5 days and killed thousands. Almost nobody talks about it today. They called it the Football War, and that name is almost perfectly wrong, because the football matches did not cause this war. They were a pretext. Something much older was already burning before a single ball was kicked. El Salvador packed 3 million people into an area smaller than Massachusetts, with most farmland in the hands of a small elite. An estimated 300,000 Salvadorans had settled across the border in Honduras. Then Honduras changed who could stay. El Salvador is one of the most densely packed countries in mainland Latin America. By the late 1960s, roughly 3 million people lived in an area about the size of Massachusetts. But density alone does not explain what was coming. The land was there. It simply belonged to almost no one. A small elite controlled most of El Salvador's farmland. The top 1% of landowners held more than 40% of all agricultural land in the country. At the other end, the poorest 40% of rural households held less than 10% of the land. Families farmed plots too small to survive on, or worked as laborers on estates they would never own. The historian William Durham studied this migration carefully. His conclusion was direct. The wave of Salvadorans leaving the country was driven not by overpopulation alone, but by this extreme inequality of land. Honduras, next door, had something El Salvador did not: room. Large stretches of jungle and scrubland sat unclaimed, and the border between the two countries was porous and loosely watched. Salvadorans crossed that border by the tens of thousands. By 1969, an estimated 300,000 had settled in Honduras, though the true figure may have been anywhere from 200,000 to 350,000. Many built lives on land they had no legal claim to. Jungle plots they cleared themselves, crops they planted with their own hands, rough homes raised from scratch. Honduras had a law for this. The 1962 agrarian reform reserved redistributed land exclusively for Honduran nationals. Between 1967 and 1969, that law was tightened. In the first half of 1969, Honduran authorities began enforcing expulsions. Salvadoran settlers were ordered off land they had spent years clearing. Reports of beatings, property destruction, and killings began reaching San Salvador, and the Salvadoran public was furious. By June 1969, both countries had already expelled thousands of people across the border. Diplomatic cables were growing cold. Then, within 6 weeks, the two nations were scheduled to play 3 football matches, World Cup qualifiers. The first match was played on June 8 in Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. Honduras won, 1-0. Salvadoran fans who traveled for the match came back with reports of harassment and violence. The Salvadoran state press repeated those accounts loudly and often. The story spread far beyond anyone who had actually been there. The Salvadoran government promoted one story above the rest. An 18-year-old named Amelia Bolaños was said to have shot herself after watching El Salvador lose on television. The account comes primarily from journalist Ryszard Kapuściński, whose reporting has been questioned for embellishment. The precise details cannot be independently confirmed. What followed is documented in multiple sources. The government staged a state funeral. The president attended. Soldiers stood at attention. Whatever the circumstances of her death, it was turned into a public spectacle designed to build nationalist anger. The second match came 1 week later, on June 15, in San Salvador. This time, El Salvador won, 3-0. Before and after the match, Honduran fans in San Salvador were attacked. Honduran diplomatic property was damaged. The football crowd had become something else entirely. Honduras responded by severing diplomatic relations. That meant no ambassadors, no formal channel, no official way for the two governments to speak to each other. El Salvador broke relations formally on June 26. The stated reason was the ongoing persecution of Salvadoran migrants. the same crisis that had been building for months before any ball was kicked. The deciding match was played on June 27 on neutral ground in Mexico City. El Salvador won 3-2 in extra time. El Salvador would go to the 1970 World Cup. The football matches did not start the crisis between these two countries. The land disputes, the migrants, the expulsions, those came first. But the matches gave the crisis something a diplomatic dispute usually lacks: a schedule, a stadium, and a crowd already assembled to feel something. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador crossed into Honduras. Troops moved along multiple roads, including the Pan American Highway, while aircraft flew overhead. The football war had begun. Those planes were relics of another era. El Salvador's Air Force flew World War II-era propeller fighters, F-4U Corsairs and P-51 Mustangs, decades after jet aircraft had become standard. When Honduran planes rose to intercept them, the two air forces clashed overhead. Historians regard the football war as one of the last conflicts in which propeller-driven fighters engaged each other in air-to-air combat. On the ground, Salvadoran forces pressed forward. They advanced roughly 40 kilometers into Honduran territory and took control of several towns along the way. A decisive breakthrough, however, never came. Within hours of the invasion, the Organization of American States convened an emergency session. Delegates from across Latin America issued a stark demand: stop fighting immediately, or face collective economic sanctions. The pressure worked. A ceasefire took effect on July 18, 1969. Most scholarly accounts settle on that date, though some sources give July 20. Either way, roughly 100 hours of fighting had ended. Under continued diplomatic pressure and the threat of sanctions, El Salvador pulled its forces back across the border by early August. It gained no territory, no concessions, nothing. The economic fallout arrived fast. In 1970, Honduras effectively shut Salvadoran goods out of its markets, breaking away from the Central American Common Market. A decade of regional trade integration unraveled in months. The two countries remained in a formal state of war for more than 11 years after the ceasefire. A peace treaty was finally signed on October 30, 1980, in Lima, Peru. Even the peace treaty didn't resolve everything. The underlying border dispute stayed in international courts until September 11, 1992, when the International Court of Justice issued its definitive ruling. Estimates put the death toll at roughly 2,000 people, most of them civilians, with around 130,000 Salvadoran migrants driven from Honduras in the aftermath. El Salvador had won the football matches and advanced on the ground. It gained no territory, protected none of its migrants, and helped dismantle the regional trade system both countries depended on. The man who brought this story to the world was Ryszard Kapuscinski, a Polish journalist whose book gave the conflict its famous name. He was a gifted writer. Historians have since established that he also embellished and sometimes invented the specific details. The most famous detail in Kapuscinski's account is Emilia Bolaños, an 18-year-old who reportedly shot herself after El Salvador lost the first qualifying match. The Salvadoran government gave her a state funeral, attended by the president and a military honor guard. That funeral and its propaganda function are confirmed by multiple sources. The specific details of the shooting are not. The death toll is contested. The historian Thomas Anderson, whose archival study remains the scholarly benchmark, estimates roughly 2,000 killed, most of them civilians. Popular and journalistic accounts have cited figures as high as 6,000. The number of Salvadorans expelled or displaced from Honduras is equally uncertain, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 300,000 depending on the source. That gap is not a minor rounding difference. It reflects how little precise documentation survives from a short, chaotic conflict. There is also a harder question about why El Salvador went to war. The historical record best supports the interpretation that it was trying to halt the expulsions and assert the rights of its migrants. But historians note that both governments were facing serious domestic pressure, and evidence suggests the crisis may have been politically convenient for both sides. The 100-hour war settled nothing. Land in El Salvador was still concentrated in the same hands. The top 1% of landowners controlled more than 40% of all agricultural land. The researcher William Durham studied what had actually driven hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans across the border. His finding was direct. It was not overpopulation. The poorest 40% of rural households held less than 10% of the land. That was what pushed people out. The structure that had caused the migration remained entirely untouched after the war. It would not be seriously reckoned with until El Salvador descended into full civil war in the 1980s. The two countries did not sign a formal peace treaty until October 1980, more than 11 years after the guns stopped. The border dispute then went to the International Court of Justice. That ruling did not come until 1992. The name Football War was spread internationally by the Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuściński. Historians use it as shorthand while noting the matches were a stage, not a cause. A land crisis remembered mostly by its least important